A little bit about our dynamic duo. Maz loves long summer days, Pilates, good food and wine, but loathes big egos, traffic and loud slurping. Fun fact, she grew up speaking 3 languages, Croatian, Macedonian and English. Dan loves oil painting, the Vienna chess opening and continental and postmodern philosophy. I think he's taken the piss, right? Yeah. But I know you're not that intelligent, mate. But he loathes people that ask baristas to make their coffee hot. The Geelong Football Club, we'll speak later, and public speaking. In his words, I have ADHD and yet somehow I have a job. Let's learn some more about them now. Please welcome Maz and Dan from Weave.
Cut that short.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for the warm welcome. It's genuinely a pleasure to be here today. I've also got imposter syndrome, by the way. We spend a lot of our time talking to our clients, but don't often get invited to do this sort of stuff. So it's genuinely really exciting to get to connect with you guys and share our story with some industry peers for a change. As James said in the intro, I'm Maz, this is Dan. We're the co-founders of Weave, an independent creative company based here in Melbourne. Importantly, I need to say from the get-go, we are not an animation studio, so just to manage expectations. But what we are is brand specialists. We build brands and bring them to life. And that covers everything from foundational brand strategy, brand storytelling, brand identity development, which is the brand building part, all the way through to packaging design, brand communications and campaigns and events and experiences, which is how we bring brands to life. So essentially our job is to help our clients connect with the people that matter to them in meaningful, interesting and authentic ways, whatever that may look like. And here's a small taste of our work. Thank you. Our talk today is titled Brands Made to Weave, and that's not just a cute play on words. It's actually a principle that's defined our process and our approach to brand building and what I think separates us from traditional design agencies, even though design is very much the heart of our business, but also ad agencies, packaging agencies and event agencies, even though they're the things that we deliver for our clients day in and day out. But to explain what I mean, I might quickly describe what a brand is, and this is not my definition. It comes from Marty Neumeier's book, The Brand Gap, which is a really great book for any brand nerds out there. First, a brand is not a logo. Second, a brand is not an identity. And finally, a brand is not a product. According to Marty, a brand is a person's gut feeling about a product, a service or an organisation. And it's specifically a person's feeling because brands are defined by individuals, not by companies or markets or publics. And it's specifically a gut feeling because people are emotional, intuitive and irrational beings. And I just really love this definition because it just describes so simply that at the end of the day, brands are just about people. And if brands are about people, then they need to engage and trigger emotional responses. And so brands need to have a personality, they need to have a voice, they need to have a point of view, they need to tell stories and create experiences and make connections, and they need to be agile, flexible, responsive and dynamic. What brands cannot be is one-dimensional, static or lifeless. And that perhaps explains why the two of us are here today talking to a room full of motion specialists like yourselves, because brands made to weave are brands made to move. And so for us, and dare I say for any other good brand agency out there, people with your skill set and expertise have never been more important, relevant and integral to the work we do as brand builders. We'll take you through our process and our work in a moment, but before we do, we just wanted to share a little bit of our backstory about how and why Weave came to be, because it's not only informed this perspective and approach to how we build brands, it's really influenced our culture. It's influenced the people we've hired, really importantly, the suppliers and the freelancers we've partnered with, and how we've chosen to work with our clients.
But before the Weave origin story, I just want to go back a little bit before that. This is me back in 2003, and I show this for two reasons. Firstly, because my hair wasn't always grey, and secondly, because I just finished studying graphic design and was about to begin my BA in animation and interactive media at RMIT. It's funny that we're here. And in fact, this is my first show reel that I cut while I was a student. And if you're wondering why it's so small on screen, it was created at the then industry standard DV PAL. So that's 768 by 576 pixels. So that is all of the pixels right there. As a student, I'd literally hadn't done much work, so I cut a show reel using 3 student projects, sliced one after another. The first was a music video, this one, Legends of Motorsport, hand-drawn and compiled in Macromedia Director, which is dead now. The second was this black and white horror film in which I cast my entire family and then killed them off one by one. And there goes my brother. I don't know why I'm showing this to a room full of animators. It makes no sense. But we're building trust here. This is about being vulnerable. So, look, I guess the reason I show you this is I started my career as an animator, and while I certainly would not consider myself an animator anymore, because I'm very out of practice and I wouldn't disgrace the title like that, I do believe that my foundational understanding of animation, motion design, and particularly storytelling has kind of given me a bit of a unique perspective and approach in my role as Executive Creative Director of Weave. I went on to animate for the next 8 years. I focused on After Effects and C4D, lots of obligatory lens flares, and a bit of stop motion whenever I could. And I worked on everything from music videos to TVCs, but most importantly, I kind of carved out a bit of a niche doing animations for large-scale events. And through that, I got to travel the world and work on some incredible projects for some massive global brands. And it was around this time that I met Mariana.
That was close to 15 years ago now, I think. And at that time, we worked together as a producer and art director duo, delivering these large-scale events and experiences. And it was a pretty amazing time. You know, as Dan said, we got to travel the world. Budgets were awesome. Makes my eyes water thinking about what we used to have to play with. And we met a bunch of talented people along the way, and many of them have actually come on to join us at Weave in some capacity or another. But it was a pretty challenging time as well. You know, agency life can be hard, and I don't mean that the work was hard. I think creativity is meant to be to some degree, and that's what we sign up for. The hard I'm talking about is probably more synonymous with agency culture. The pressure, the hours, the workload, the expectation, the inflexibility, and at times the over-indexing on margins and profits, perhaps over and above anything else, namely people and the work itself. And that tension that goes hand in hand with agency life. And thankfully, I think the industry has evolved since then, but certainly 10 years ago, what I'm describing was not uncommon. And for two people who perhaps lean a little more closely towards introversion and add a dash of anxiety and perfectionism in for good measure, environments like that can be pretty unhealthy, can create pretty unhealthy relationships with work and really negatively impact your mental health. So in a moment of inspiration, or, you know, call it desperation, we felt there just had to be a better way and an easier way to do what we do. And so we took a little bit of a leap of faith. Interweave Group, as we were known back then, was launched in late 2012. We set up shop in this little space in Albert Park, which was more share house than office, truth be told. We had one client who came along for the ride, and we basically picked up where we left off, continuing the live event space, producing these big shows, both here and overseas. And you can see some of the work from early Interweave days there on screen. And you're probably wondering how we went from doing all of that to the work that you saw in our show reel and all the stuff that we're known for today, because it does seem like quite the evolution. And to some degree, it really has been, whilst events aren't necessarily a traditional pathway into building a brand agency, and whilst there has been a lot of learning along the way, what I've come to realise is that our background in events is, in fact, what's given us our unique insight and perspective. And I think it's really what's made us so well placed to do what we do today. And the reason for that is because when you're delivering events, particularly the large-scale, multifaceted events that we produce, you're not only creating a brand and an identity and a narrative for that experience, you're then tasked with bringing that to life across every medium possible, in physical spaces, on screens, through stories and content and performance. More importantly, though, when you're delivering events, your number one priority is to engage and connect with an audience above everything else. And so that audience and those people are always at the forefront of your mind as you're creating and you're making. And unlike most of the other work that we do, because of the nature of a live experience, you then get to see how that audience reacts in real time, and that's pretty powerful. And going all the way back to Marty's definition, as we now know, brands are about people. And when you think about it, events are about people too. And I think that's really what set us up for who we are and what we do today. And I think it's actually the differentiator between us and a lot of other agencies out there. But fast forward to today, and over 10 years in, not only have we navigated this transition from event to brand specialists, we've also grown what started as a really small project team to a company made up of some of the best, most talented, most humble and hardworking people I've ever had the pleasure of meeting and working with. They blow us away every single day with the thoughtfulness and the care that they put into their work, and it's not lost on either of us how fortunate we are to have them by our side.
Our little business has experienced many shifts and changes over the years, but probably the biggest and most notable was this sort of recent shift into the specialism of drinks, the drinks category. And that was partially accidental or partially planned. It's an area that we really love. We're not alcoholics, but we are probably best known for this in our version of us today. And it's probably largely attributed to the success of this brand. 4 Pillars is one of our earliest and strongest client relationships, and since they started back in 2013 as a small boutique Australian distillery, they're now sort of become, I would say, the largest gin brand in the country. And our little business has certainly grown up alongside theirs. And while I wouldn't want to take credit for their success, because they are incredibly clever people in their own right, I do think we can claim a small role in helping them to be what they are today. To 4 Pillars, we are their full-service creative partner, so that involves everything from establishment of brand guidelines, website design, digital content, and of course, packaging, which you can see up there. And that extends into the core range, into collaboration gins, distillery series gins, limited edition release gins, and their range of pre-mixed cocktails, or as we call them, the gin tins. And beyond packaging and photography, we also work on all of their national campaigns. So considering this is a motion festival, I thought I'd show you some stuff that moves. And we'll step through a few projects to give you a sense of how we work. The first project is one we did way back in 2018. Brand campaign. I would say it's not necessarily our best work. In fact, it's definitely not our best work, but it is probably the most significant in terms of the growth of Weave. So it was important because, first of all, it was 4 Pillars' first campaign, but also it was Weave's first campaign, working from concept straight through to delivery. And if I'm brutally honest, I do think it kind of shows. It literally breaks all of the kind of effective advertising rules that you are taught. The campaign is not consistent. The messaging's all over the shop. The logo is too small, and most of the time we didn't even show product. And yet, despite all this, it is still to date one of 4Pillars' most successful campaigns, and arguably put them on the map.
A bit of context, though, before we get into it. It was 4Pillars' 5th year in market at that point. The brand was doing really well. It had a super strong following of loyal gin fans. But outside of Victoria, 4Pillars was practically unknown. Hendrick's and Bombay Sapphire were still the biggest selling gins by far. And so 4Pillars really needed to expand their brand awareness with the national campaign.
But 4Pillars were a small craft business whose internal mantra really was, we are makers, not marketers. And as a result, they claimed they'd never do advertising. And until I got a phone call from Matt Jones, the co-founder of 4Pillars and a good friend of Maz and Al's, he explained that they wanted to do this national campaign and kind of asked, do you guys want to do it? And up until this point, Weave had just not done traditional advertising. In fact, I'd sort of made it a personal badge of honour that I would never do advertising again because I thought it was dumb and stupid and all this kind of stuff. Underneath, I was probably worried we couldn't do it. We had no right to do, and we would fail horrifically on a very public stage, and everyone would laugh and the world would explode and life is meaningless. I explained my nervousness to Matt, and he was like, mate, you understand our brand better than anyone. You understand storytelling, motion and production, and you can design. What is holding you back? So with that little locker room speech, we went on to do our first national campaign for 4Pillars. And while the purpose of the campaign was very much awareness beyond Victoria, the focus was on Rare Dry Gin, which is their signature gin. And like all 4Pillars gins, they are distilled with whole Australian fresh oranges, along with a load of really lovely Australian botanicals. It's kind of the orange that separates them from, say, Hendrick's, which is all about cucumbers, blah, blah, blah. So the idea was to kind of lead the campaign through the humble orange. And so these are a couple of concepts that we put forward. The idea was oranges are taking over. And the idea was that we were going to have these gigantic oranges in, sort of taking over landmarks in each of the major capital cities. And this is how they turned out. And we used cut paper and collage to kind of create these compositions, giving them a little bit of a tactile craft feel, because remember, they're makers, not marketers. So we had planned to animate these in a very sort of Terry Gilliam, sort of Monty Python style, using stop motion. But then there was a little update to the brief. The client was very clear. They loved this idea of focusing on oranges, and they loved where the poster designs were heading, but they wanted people to drink more drinks, which is kind of fair enough in hindsight. How do you get more people to drink 4Pillars G&Ts this summer? So I started to think about how we could adapt the collage to sort of make it work, but it just felt a bit tacked on. So we decided to sort of try and solve this new problem in a very new way. So what is a G&T? It's, at its simplest, it is the easiest way to drink gin. It's made of 4 ingredients: gin, tonic, loads of ice, like I'm talking loads of ice, more than you're thinking right now, and a big fat wedge of orange. And so with that in mind, we had this idea of sort of creating the most elaborate how-to video for the world's simplest cocktail. And this was a really short turnaround brief, a really quick storyboard that I sketched up. I think it might have been the night before, showing this sort of elaborate process of making a G&T that involved guillotines and cloche reveals and all this sort of stuff. Somehow 4Pillars had the confidence to sort of buy it. I'm very grateful they did, and this is how it turned out. Thanks. So yeah, that was the final result. It was a fairly confused, fairly inconsistent street poster campaign, one part collage and another part sort of Wes Anderson-inspired how-to video.
Despite all of that, the brand impact was quite surprising to all of us. The campaign deeply connected with consumers and the results showed significant lifts in all key metrics. Truth be told, we had no idea what any of that meant at the time, but it turns out it was pretty incredible for 4Pillars. But for us too, it was the beginning of building this strength and capability in the creative comm space, and also a valuable reminder to saying yes to opportunities even when your fear response is telling you to stay in your own lane. And it's just so important and a real, a sort of a reminder that there's a lot of truth in the saying, fake it until you become it.
And since that first 4Pillars campaign, there have been many more. Funnily enough, we actually just finished working on this year's campaign, which went live last month. And it was very much a return to old, taking a lot of inspiration from that first campaign, heroing Red Dry Gin via the humble orange. The next project that I wanted to share was, I think, a really good example of sort of motion design thinking for what was effectively a static design brief. And I think it's proof that the sort of skills and learnings of an animator are super transposable and valuable for brands beyond just the realms of making things move.
Again, a bit of context. Since its release, Bloody Shiraz Gin had become a bit of a phenomenon and fan favourite. It was a result of an experiment gone right, steeping gin with Shiraz grapes, which created this delicious liquid, slightly sweet, slightly fruity, and as it turned out, the perfect gateway gin for those who claimed not to be gin drinkers.
So each year since its launch, 4Pillars had sort of celebrated the new vintage of Shiraz grapes with the release of this limited edition bottle. And up until this stage, they'd been working directly with artists to sort of create these custom bottles. They mainly featured sort of illustrative type on the front, and it was screen printed onto the glass as a bit of a keepsake. So they'd sort of been doing it for 2 years. This was their third. And they really wanted to shift the focus away from the artist and move towards focusing on the gin itself. So in lieu of an artist, it was our turn to have a bit of a crack at it. And I think just the insight for us, the genius of Bloody Shiraz Gin, was more than just this sort of unique flavour that Maz was talking about before. It was very much about this sort of deep purple colour that made it visibly quite different and instantly recognisable. And I guess as well, a gin that is steeped in Shiraz grapes had up until this point never been done before. So it kind of represented something new and progressive and a little bit luxury as well. So we presented this insight back to them and the idea of sort of focusing the design on what made the gin so unique, that purple bloody liquid. So as you can imagine, our process is a lot about benchmarking and inspiration and working at how we would represent this sort of modernity and the luxe qualities. And we would look at luxurious brands and look at a load of textures and sort of liquid textures for inspo. And we also looked at how we would represent liquid in a kind of dynamic graphic form as well. And then we presented a mock-up, and this is the one. Usually there's heaps, but for this one it was just the one. And the idea being we just wanted to get this idea across of no type, just bloody inspired liquid pattern. And we knew as well as the packaging design, we were on the hook to deliver all of the launch content as well. And the primary touch point was going to be screen and digital and social. So I had this idea, what if the first time people see our new label design and it's moving? So for the client presentation, I created this very quick and shit animation as a bit of a proof of concept for this simple idea. And then we put forward a little title or like a product name, if you like, that would sort of lead the sort of launch narrative. And for us, it was all about just one word. It's a word that really does best describe the liquid. So from a sort of old winemaking terminology, blooding the fruit is what they do. And from a sort of a word of that is also a word that kind of captures the attitude and irreverence of Australians, that sort of let's give it a bloody go. So we kind of like that, and it also captured the sort of attitude of Four Pillars when they were making this gin as well. So again, I pulled together this very average animation for that client presentation because, as many of you probably know, half the time the biggest battle is getting these ideas across to a client, getting them to see your idea nice and clearly. And in this instance, it was just a really quick cloth simulator in C4D and a text and a mask in After Effects that sort of did the trick. We then went on to sort of create some animations, and weirdly enough, to sort of get the packaging done, we needed to animate it first. And we played with a load of different options, and these were the sort of the final three, if you like, all inspired by different aspects of liquid in a glass. And thankfully, they chose the best pattern, which was this one. And we then designed the actual bloody word mark and the wider layout, and always testing in context of a bottle. And then this is the final result. Our design screen printed directly onto the glass. From a front view, only the liquid pattern is visible. And from the side, our bloody word mark features vertically. And I also want to just quickly call out the beautiful typesetting that my team did on the back label, because often I think we just judge packaging by what we see on the front. The reality is they are a 360 object, and the layout of the storytelling and back label product mandatories is just as important, and definitely in this instance, I think completes the design. And then finally, the reveal. That simple idea for the design to be moving the first time people saw it actually happened. We did that photo shoot, and we photographed a clean skin bottle and just comped that liquid pattern in After Effects. It's a very simple animation, but I think it was really effective. With the success of that bottle, we were then asked to do a dedicated campaign for Bloody Shiraz Gin. And we were able to leverage heaps of the design assets that we'd created for the new campaign. And it was a really bold project, and these are some of the out-of-home posters from it. And then there was a film component as well. And the idea here is that drinking Bloody Shiraz Gin for the first time is a bloody revelation. So there were many tests created to simulate that liquid, and we worked really closely actually with the 3D artist who might be in the audience, Octavio, on all of the liquid simulations. There were hundreds, it was crazy. And also worked with an old friend, Lucas Schrank, who may also be in the audience somewhere, to do all of the lighting and texturing of that liquid. It was a massive team effort, as you'd expect, and a really bold campaign for Four Pillars.
The last project we wanted to share with you is a little less motion heavy. However, nothing really captures the scale of our growth and our evolution as much as the rebrand of Tui's. If you'd asked either of us that we would be responsible for the brand and pack refresh of an Australian icon, a brand that had been around for over 150 years, we literally would have thought you were crazy. But a couple of years ago, it's precisely what we had the opportunity to do.
So if anyone's hasn't heard of Tui's, they're kind of like New South Wales version of VB or Carlton Draft. And for many years, they were the beer of choice of all Sydney-siders. But in recent years, they'd really lost out their number one position to new beer brands like Great Northern, that's the beer from up here. And then the fact that the sort of beer is a bit out of fashion. And so you had new players like seltzer and mixed cocktails entering the market. So the brand was in trouble, and our challenge was to refresh that brand and the packaging to make it relevant for a new generation of beer drinkers without losing those sort of rusted on Tui's faithful. And our first job was to really understand the brand, all 150 years of it. And we essentially became sort of historians for the first part of the project, sort of sifting through old packaging and advertising posters to get a real sense of where the brand had been most successful, and then draw inspiration from those elements from the past to sort of help guide where we head for the future. So this is the sort of packaging that we inherited, only 5 SKUs, and this is where it landed. And my favourite sort of piece of feedback from people when they first see the packaging is to ask what actually changed, because the answer is literally everything, and yet it still feels the same. Every single asset was updated, but the essence of Tui's was preserved. It's just a little bit better. And that was no accident. It really was a result of a lot of deep research, solid brand strategy, and of course, razor-sharp graphic design. So to sort of better understand that, I thought I'd just go through a few of the sort of key brand assets, or DBAs, as we say in the industry, how they evolved and how they sort of all come together in the final result. So the first kind of main bit of the project was the Tui's logo mark. And so as you can see here, it's kind of comprised of two assets. It's the Tui's word mark, or red plate as it was known, and then the stag's head sitting on top. And these two assets, they sort of form this unbreakable logo lockup, and it's really hard to use, particularly imagine putting it on a landscape format, imagine dealing with those massive antlers. It was a bloody nightmare. So at the early stages of the process, before we started doing any design, we talked to the client a lot about this idea, or proposed this idea of separating those two assets, sort of almost uncoupling them or liberating them from each other, so that firstly we could create more brand flexibility between these two assets, but then also we could sort of like give the red plate a bit more prominence, because it had been overpowered for too many years by this bloody stag's head. So to refresh the word mark, we first looked into the past, and we noticed little tiny design details throughout history, and we're drawing on sort of bolder, more confident expressions of that word mark. And our sort of development, it started with the 1980 expression of the word mark. We sort of reduced its weight and then added back in all of the little subtle serifs. We kind of brought back the thick and thin of those double O's, and then we tucked in the terminal on the S, and ultimately this is where it landed. And I remember being on a Zoom call with my team and the typographer, David Foster, and we literally for 30 minutes discussed the letter S. We could have gone on longer, but I think it's an indication of just the kind of level of detail that a project like this requires. The next bit was the Tui stag, and of the two, it was probably the most recognisable and distinct, but I guess our question was, where the fuck did this thing come from? So we did a bit of digging, and it turns out that the founding brothers of Tui's, John and James Tui, they liked drinking at this local pub in Sydney called the Bald-Faced Stag, and the hotel had above it this sort of sitting stag on its facade. So they loved the pub and they loved the stag, so they literally took the stag and made it their brewery logo. In those days, there were no IP laws, so that was totally permissible. We also noticed that the original stag was a full-bodied sitting stag, and over time it had sort of evolved to this stag's head that looked a little bit like a sports mascot. So I love this idea of kind of returning back to a full-bodied stag, but updating its very passive sitting position, that's something that was a bit more active and a little bit more relevant. So we worked really closely with an illustrator to develop the stag shape and the new posture, and here is the final result. A completely new stag and a new word mark, yet it is, I believe, distinctively Tui's. And that sort of idea of the flexible relationship between those two elements is an example here where, you know, they really do support each other rather than cancel each other out. And packaging was only a small part of this project. We also needed to work off-pack and create this sort of broader brand design system. So we talked a lot about the red plate, the word mark, being the sort of foundational brick in the design system. And that idea really allowed us to get this sort of vertical orientation across the line, which that may seem like a small thing, but for a big corporate company like TUI's, it takes a lot of convincing, a lot of hand-holding, and of course, a bit of client confidence to sort of approve a decision like this. So I do think it was a bit of a win for us, and of course, the brand and graphic design as well. Yay. Our project team worked on every packaging format you can think of. So there was cartons and slabs and clusters and six-packs, bottle shrinkies, long necks. The list was enormous. And we also created brand merch for all the cool kids to love TUI's again, leveraging some of the old assets we found during the old research phase. We created pub signage, we clad a truck, and we did large-scale out-of-home ads as well, and street posters, of course. And then we wrapped all this thinking together as a comprehensive brand book and guidelines, and showing not just how to use the brand, but how to understand the brand story and making sure the meaning behind these various brand assets never gets lost again and is always appreciated. So ultimately, we were really proud of this project. It's not often you get to reshape Australian icon, make TUI's cool again, and relevant for a new gen of beer drinkers, and hopefully set it up for the next 150 years. So, cheers.